Sit back, folks, and relax. You might want to get your favorite beverage. And I'm going to tell you a story about my ancestors. You know, the art of storytelling is almost lost today, but I still love a good story. And here's the story of my ancestors. The earliest known Coxes were known to live in the Pennsylvania area as they were Quakers. And the old Quakers had good records. And the earliest Coxes were very active in the Quaker church and were very respected. Sometime in the 1700s, they migrated south from Pennsylvania down the Great Wagon Road with the family of Squire Boone, who was Daniel Boone's father. They followed the Great Wagon Road until somewhere in the edge of Guilford County and Randolph County they settled, and the area they settled in today is in Randolph County. It was near the Cox Mill area, as they were millers and ran grist mills wherever they settled. Now, they got into trouble with the Quakers there in Randolph County because they did not agree with the policy of the British Crown that was always raising the taxes on them and forcing them to use the British coined money. They always would prefer to use the money they coined here in North Carolina, and they wanted the freedom of running their business as they saw fit and not being robbed by the British tax collectors. So therefore, they got into a little bit of trouble with the Quaker church because the Quaker church taught you should always obey the authorities. And the Coxes, they just didn't understand this, and they were thrown out of the Quaker church for this reason. And they decided to move west to the frontier, and they came to western North Carolina and first settled in the area of North Cove, which is in present-day McDowell County, North Carolina. And later they moved on up the mountains into Mitchell County and finally settled in the Crabtree area right on the edge of what is present Mitchell and Yancey County. Now, my wife has always accused me of looking back and instead of enjoying the present or enjoying or looking toward the future. But I think it's good to understand the past so that we will have a better understanding of how to avoid the problems of the past and how to do better in the future. And for that reason, I've tried to get as much information as possible about my ancestors. I owe a lot to my Aunt Peggy Bell Cox and my cousin Charles Cox, who have helped me a lot in this research. They did much of the painstaking work before the age of the internet, and they had to make a lot of trips to Raleigh, to the area libraries. They wrote letters to relatives, and they collected a wealth of information over the years. And since they worked so hard to collect this information, they need to be recognized for it. Now, I've been recently talking to my cousin Charles Cox, trying to get information from him so that I can write it up for our descendants who follow after us. Now, from the information I've been able to obtain, it looks like that William Cox was the Quaker who lived in Randolph County at Cox's Mill, and he's the one that came to the mountains of North Carolina. But he lived down there on the PD River in Piedmont, North Carolina, and sometime after 1776, he moved to western North Carolina. And at the grist mill he operated in Randolph County, this was a congregating area for the people at that time. They came from around the surrounding area to get together and talk about the latest news and gossip and talked about politics because they didn't have newspapers back then. And so the people would congregate at my ancestors' grist mill, and it was a location that was well known at that time. Now, William was kind of a rebel rouser. He didn't agree with just following what the King of England dictated. He felt that people should be left alone to pursue their own interests without taxation and interference from the king. And due to his liberal ideas, the Quaker Church, they tried to discipline him. He begged for forgiveness once, but not long after that, he spoke up again and was thrown out of the church for good. For that reason, he moved his family to the frontier in the mountains of western North Carolina. Now, two of his sons were Isaac N. Cox and David N. Cox. We are descended from David N. Cox. David N. Cox's son was Elisha Cox, and Elisha was my great-grandfather. Now, Elisha married Matilda Hall, who was the daughter of Elisha Hall. She inherited the property on Rockhouse Creek, and our grandfather Nelson later inherited this property from her. There were caves on this property known as the Hall Caves, and during the Civil War, deserters lived in these caves. My father's brothers, Clemmy and Worth, explored those caves when they were young, and they found buttons and other Civil War artifacts in the caves. Now, Charlie McKinney was one of the original settlers in this area. He lived on the property where the current apple orchard in Alta Pass is located. One of his daughters, Flurry McKinney, married Jacob Hollifield. Jacob was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. And Charles tells me that Flurry's house was located about 100 yards off of Highway 226 down the old Dula Road on the right. And the first picture there shows her standing on her front porch of this house with a spinning wheel. Now, Charles tells me that sometime during the Civil War, Flurry, Flurry was born in 1824, and she died in 1920. But during the Civil War, she heard a lot of noise and commotion going on just beyond her property toward the Gillespie Gap. And so she went to investigate to see what was happening, and she saw the soldiers coming up the mountain. And as they came up the mountain, they were tearing down her split rail fences, which she had put up to keep her cattle in. She watched them take the split rails up to the site of the present Mineral Museum at Gillespie Gap, and they set up camp there. And they used her split rails for their campfires. She was very upset about this, and she was upset because they were on her property and hadn't asked permission. So she came out of the woods and approached their camp and demanded to see the man in charge. The commander came out, and she wanted to know why he had destroyed her fence. He told her that he did not know it was a fence. It looked like old wood. She said that since you have burnt my fence, you can build me another one. She continued to rake him over the coals about tearing down and burning her fence. She made the comments about what kind of lawless bunch of outlaws are you to destroy an old woman's fence like this. He said, where are we going to get new rails to build you a new fence? She told him the woods are full of trees, and she expected him to cut the trees, split the rails, and rebuild her fence. The story goes that he had the soldiers to rebuild the fence. Now, Flurry and Jacob had a son named Sam. And Sam had a son named Clay, who ran a sawmill on Dula Road, on the other side of the road from Flurry's house. When my dad, Bill Cox, was supposed to be going to school, he would play hooky and work at the sawmill. Dad said he never liked school and would much rather work at a sawmill. Another son of Flurry and Jacob's was Mills Hollifield, who was my great-grandfather. He was the father of my grandmother, Susie Hollifield Cox. So you see how I'm related to Flurry. Flurry was Mills's mother, and Mills was my great-grandfather. Now, Nelson had inherited the Rockhouse Creek property from the Halls. Nelson was my grandfather, Nelson Cox. But Rockhouse Creek was way out in the wilderness, away from everyone. The land on Grassy Creek was owned by J.P. Dixon, and J.P. was the pastor of Grassy Creek Baptist Church. Nelson's father, Elisha, had married Dosia Dixon, who had inherited the land at Grassy Creek from her father. Charles told me that Nelson's brother, Tom, inherited the Dixon's property on Grassy Creek. Since Nelson was living so far out in the wilderness, Charles says that he agreed to give Nelson 8 acres on Grassy Creek. And then Nelson moved to Grassy Creek with his family, where he lived out the rest of his life. And you can see the pictures of this property. Now, a brother of Flurry, the lady with the spinning wheel, her brother's name was Jippin' Joe, and Jippin' Joe was a Confederate soldier. Now, some of the old stories say that he got his name because he dodged the bullets in the Civil War so much that he gypped fate and stayed alive. Some say that he stayed alive by acting dead and laying in the blood with his friends and comrades who had been shot. But he was quite a colorful character. And my mother says that at one time he left the family and was gone for years. They didn't know where he was. He apparently had gone out to Salt Lake City and joined up with the Mormons and supposedly had several families out there. But he eventually came back to North Carolina and is buried in the Yellow Mountain Cemetery there in North Carolina, right on the edge of Avery and Mitchell County. Now, picture 3 is a picture of Elisha and Tom Cox. Elisha lived from 1853 till 1934. And there's a picture of his brother Tom Cox and Aunt Huldy. And there's a picture of Elisha holding his birthday cake. They say that, I don't know how old he was, but he was up close to 80 years old there, is what my cousins tell me. Now here's the site of Elisha's home. You see the big white double wide trailer sitting there. That is where his house used to sit. And here you see the water traces that fed his stone mill, his stone grist mill. And here's looks like a barn. It's the building that housed his grist mill. And here's the building of the grist mill. Looks like a big barn, and Elisha built this building back in the 1800s, still standing. And to the right there is where the water wheel would have been. It's been moved now. The old stone grist stones have been moved to the Woody property, and they're just, Charles told me, on the ground there on the Woody property right now. Now the next picture is a picture of Columbus Mills Hollifield and his family. Laura Greene and a little child. And then this next picture is Columbus Mills Hollifield and all his children. And in that picture you can see my grandmother Susie there. Now the next picture is a picture of Tom, Will, and Nelson, who are my Tom, Will, and Nelson were the sons of Elisha Cox. And Nelson was my grandfather. And here's a picture of my grandparents, Nelson and Susie. Nelson lived from 1881 until 1945. He'd been out in the field plowing and came home and told my grandmother he was going to lay down and take a rest. And when he rested a little bit, he'd eat his lunch. Well, she got his lunch ready for him and went back to check on him, and he was gone. He died in his sleep. Now there's a picture of grandmother Susie standing in her yard. Looks like it's right in the front yard of her house there in Grassy Creek. And where she was standing looks like it was the same location as this picture here, which shows her front yard today. And today the house is no longer standing, but that's right where the front yard of her house is, or would have been. Now here's Nelson's sons, the Cox boys. All of them there in that black and white picture. Here's the other one. My dad is always on the left in those pictures. Now here's Nelson's and Susie's daughters. And here's Uncle Floyd Woody. Floyd is the one that told me a lot of the old stories. And he said that his wife, who was Aunt Leela, lived with Elisha growing up. Elisha raised her. And that he used to go and visit with Leela for 7 years before they got married. He had visited a lot there at Elisha's house. He said that Elisha sat down and talked to him a lot and told him a lot about the history of the family and all of that stuff. He was a wealth of information. And all of this information is written in my story, which I called it My Search for My Family Roots. And I've sent anyone who wants a copy of that story. It tells all about all of these people that I'm showing in these pictures. Okay. Right here is my great grandfather, William Henry Monroe. Now, William Henry Monroe was a full-blooded Seminole Indian. He lived in Florida, and the story of him is in my the story that I wrote. It's very interesting how he came to live with the Monroes and was raised by the Monroe family. And the Monroe family there in Florida were quite wealthy. They owned a business that manufactured turpentine. And that was a big business at that time, because that's how they sealed all of the old wooden sailing ships at that time. And he had a pretty big operation running that business. Now the next picture is my grandfather, William Frank Monroe. Now William Frank Monroe lived from 1884 till 1934. And he lived in Florida and he became a pen pal with Florence Greene, who lived in Spruce Pine, North Carolina. Now, they wrote for years back and forth as pen pals, and finally, it was probably around 1915 or somewhere along there. I don't know the exact year, but this picture was taken on the date of his marriage, they say. And he was a young man. He got on a train and he rode up to Spruce Pine to see my grandmother, Florence Greene, and they got married, and this picture was taken on the date of their marriage. Now, here's a picture of Florence Greene. Florence Greene was of Irish descent. She had red hair, and if you notice the dark glasses, as a child, she got German measles, and it blinded her, and she was blind throughout her life. I always wore those dark glasses, but I remember her eyes were blue, very blue, and she had red hair. Now, here's a picture of my parents, Bill and Robelia, and there's a picture of me and James. I was about 5 years old at this time in our home in Lake Orion. Well, I hope you enjoyed looking at these pictures, and hopefully they turn out to where they look a little better than the last time I tried. Thanks for watching.